One day soon, I'm going to be the boss.
And I'm going to teach and empower the next generation.
One day soon, I'll use science to save the planet.
And one day soon, I'll save lives.
Right now, I'm ready to take the first step.
No matter what your goal, choose a pathway at Southern Cross University to transform your future.
G'day and welcome to the Choosing Your Uni National Virtual Expo. I'm your host for this session, Rob Malicki, and welcome to this session on getting beyond the marketing hype. Let's face it, choosing a university is one of the bigger decisions that you make in your life, not because you can't change your mind, but because it is something that will eventually take years of your life and literally cost tens of thousands of dollars. So you want to make sure you get that decision right, which is actually exactly why we decided to run this National Virtual Expo. But today's guest, Jason Enser, the creator of After ATAR, he knows quite a bit about getting beyond the marketing hype. And we'll have a chat with him in just a minute. But before we do, remember that if you've got any questions or comments, you can drop them in the chat as we're going, and we'll try to get to them by the end of the session. And anything we don't get to, we will be answering on the Choosing Your Uni Discord. You can find the details in the session description down below. And if you're a parent, we do have a Facebook community just for you and the specific questions that you might have about looking after your student. So details in the session description down below. I'm coming today from Gadigal land in Sydney, so I pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land. Let's go and have a chat now with Jason Enser from After ATAR over on the couch. Let's go. Jason Enser, from the founder of After ATAR, welcome to the National Virtual Expo. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I think this is one of the most important sessions of the whole National Virtual Expo, Jason, because obviously when somebody's trying to make their choice about which university they're going to go to, there is so much marketing out there, isn't there? From Google search, paid advertising, to articles, to videos. Like, there's just stuff everywhere. And it's really hard to cut through the noise to understand what information is relevant to you as a prospective student. What do you think?
Yeah, and yeah, you're 100% correct. There is a lot of noise, and we've had we've got two sons. We had one son go through year 12 last year. We got a second one going through it this year. And having been on the inside of the sector for 30 years, part of After ATAR is to help, I guess, dilute the stress around, where am I going to go? And there's obviously, as you say, there's a lot of qualitative information out there. There's a lot of marketing spin out there. There's a lot of, we are the best at this, we are the best at that, we are ranked here, we're ranked there. And, they provide signals, but the amount of data that's actually available within, public portals and state portals and national portals, that tells a different story. How well is the university doing with its dropout rates? How well is it doing with equity? How well is it doing in offers versus applications? There's marketing spin that says, we have a high reputation, we have high prestige signals, we have a high selection bias. And then you look at the data and it says, well, actually, you make 100% offers to 100% applications. That's great. You should get that out there. It
Yeah, I
shouldn't
agree.
be about preserving how the institution appears in society. It should be making the pathway from being a high school student to a university student as frictionless and as painless as possible.
I was so excited when I discovered after ATAR a couple of months ago, because as somebody who's been in the sector like you for 25 years, I've known about these data sources, and personally, I would have gone and looked up literally the original spreadsheets where all of this data lives, and I would dig through things to find what I'm looking for. But finally, to have a site where all of that stuff is really accessible is incredible. So I'm really excited to dive into that. But maybe by way of getting there, I'd really love to dive into the global rankings side of things, right? Because obviously, when we start looking for universities, the first thing we see, because it's made so visible through the marketing, is we rank X on this ranking over here on a global scale, and we rank on the sustainable development goals over here like this, and it looks really impressive. But can we maybe just have a quick talk about those big picture rankings, big global
Hmm.
rankings, the sort of
Hmm.
niche rankings that are out there, how they work, and in what circumstances those might be useful for a prospective student?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one. I sort of start to feel that the idea of league tables and bestseller lists and top 10 and all that kind of stuff, I think that's very much a 20th century kind of
Construct.
concept, and I don't think it. I think it applies less and less in an age where we're working towards hyper personalization, hyper individualization, for better or worse, of how people learn, how educational pathways go, and I think the focus on rankings, and it should be noted there are lots of different kind of ranking um, providers out there. They are provided externally, in terms of, like Times Higher Education and so forth. Um,
US world rankings, academic
yeah, yeah,
rankings of world universities. You do a Google search, you'll find probably half a dozen of them.
yeah, and you'll find that institutions don't just participate in one; they participate in a number of them. And one of the main issues is that if you've been part of that process, you get to see how one ranking system's requirements and conditions contradict those of the other. And so you've got institutions.
Can I just pause you there?
Yeah,
Because you
yeah.
just said something super interesting. Take us behind that curtain, right? So most people who are watching this won't realize, yeah, they see a ranking, they just think, oh, it's been independently evaluated, therefore it must be a good source of truth. But what you just said was very interesting. It sounds like universities can do quite a bit to, influence those rankings.
Well, yeah, it's an application process, and you provide evidence that supports the metric that the ranking system is requiring from you. Um, and certainly, as with any application process, there's a skill set involved in making the best argument and putting the best evidence forward. One of the things that strikes me, though, is that there might be a ranking that's focused entirely on commercialization of research, and it completely doesn't look at what they call the cultural externalities that might come from something else. Then there'll be another ranking that focuses on its impact on society, but not on commercialization. In fact, they can work against that, and it's just that kind of finding the ranking that best positions you when you can say, oh, I'm number one or I'm number two or number three or eighth or ninth, might not necessarily reflect what you're actually good at. That's the ranking that works well for your application process or the application architecture that you have behind what you're submitting to a ranking system.
Yeah, definitely. So when I get asked about rankings and the like, those kind of big picture rankings, I tend to say like, what's the story that you're hoping to tell about your experience? Like, what are you looking for? Who are you as a person? So and looking at how that lines up with these big global rankings. So you've got to be honest with yourself, who you are. So if you're interested in prestige, you on your resume, all you're worried about is prestige, and that's probably more important to an international student audience than to the domestic local audience, but not exclusively. Okay, prestige. well then the fact that a uni has a huge global ranking may be important to you, but it's important to you. It's not necessarily important to a prospective employer. So if that's important to you, you actually need to build that into your story when you're talking about what you're going to this institution to study, and you're putting on your LinkedIn profile, like the fact that this uni is ranked number X, or it has the best ranking in responding to climate change or something like this. That's got to be part of your story too. And in that case, that can be something which I think is genuinely useful, because you're basically leveraging a brand as part of what you're trying to present to the world. So that's quite a complex process, though, isn't it? So it's like master's level personal branding, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But that story can be very compelling. I'm just thinking about social impact. I won't name any institutions, but Jason, you obviously know who they are. A number of institutions talk a lot about their social impact and how they rank really highly. Fantastic. Maybe that really speaks to you as an individual who wants to do good stuff in society. But that doesn't mean it's going to actually make any difference to your experience at university whatsoever.
Yeah.
But you can leverage the fact that it's got this huge ranking and have that on your LinkedIn profile once you've been to that institution. You can say, I went to this university and it was number one in the world for, social impact. Therefore, that reflects nicely on me. But that's quite a high level of thought, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's useful, as you say, to start the conversation. But it's a starter. It's like, I read this great book. It's currently number one. It's called, Hail Mary, that kind of thing. It starts the conversation, but then you go deeper, into, well, what's it about? What's in it? What's the data? Like, the science, and that's amazing. And I think that kind of conversation where you're not just exchanging a signifier that somebody else has created for you. They've said they're number one. They're able to show it. They've been assessed, and that's all you're exchanging, as opposed to your understanding, I guess, of the institution based on the information that's actually available out there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and that they focus on brand, that it's that quick, easy signifier aspect that everyone wants. You see the logo, you see the colors, you see the ranking. It's like, yep, great, they're sorted. I don't need to think any further on that. And after ATAR does make a pitch, it says, here's the data, here's how it all joins together. Some effort will be required to help work through that. You look at all the Reddit forums, all the Discord forums, and that's where I went. I started from, well, where are they congregating? What are they talking about? What are their concerns? And to be fair, rankings don't come up nearly as often as institutions would like.
That's true.
The color of their brand doesn't come up. They want to know, are campuses busy? Is this, how many people will succeed in this course? What kind of jobs am I likely to get? Will I enjoy it? Who are my cohort? It's the everyday stuff, the minutiae of actually doing the course, and that's the work that you don't see. There's a lot of effort to get applications, to get preferences, during the pipeline, but that, and we're seeing those discussions now, but that support and equity aspects after you're enrolled, that's the stuff that needs visibility.
How about we jump into after ATAR then and have a look, because obviously there's some, when you go to look at data, there are so many different sorts of data, and as we've sort of been alluding to through this conversation, it really depends on what you're looking at and what's important to you as to what sort of information you go looking for in a resource like After ATAR. Once again, this is a free website for you to jump in there and explore. Do you want to maybe pull up a screen share, Jason, and we can sort of walk through and maybe try and answer some of the key questions that students might have. You'll obviously be familiar with what some of those questions may be, but while you're working to pull up the screen, to me, like some of the things you've already mentioned, for example, entry requirements, like what percentage of students that apply for this course actually get admitted? What percentage drop out? How many people are dropping out? Those, I think, are some core questions. What does it cost those are really interesting questions. So how about we explore some of those sort of questions and the ones that you think are most important right on your site. So let's say you want to pick a particular program at USyd and you want to look into all of the information about that. How do we do that?
Okay, so we've got obviously what happens when, what's the retention rates? Retention obviously is a big subject that's coming up. Obviously, there are national ways of calculating retention versus how institutions actually do it internally. There can be some disconnect there. Obviously,
And retention, for those people watching along, retention basically means you stay in your course. You don't drop out.
yes, yeah,
Yeah.
correct. Yeah, you come back for a second year and a third year and so forth. How many finish? How many make it to fourth year? What are the likely starting salaries? What's the student satisfaction? Those kind of quilt information around, do students like going to that institution?
So actually, interestingly, Jason, so I have got a session. We do have a session as part of the virtual expo on Compare Ed. But what I love about here is that you've got those kind of color signals that shows where an institution sort of sits, in terms of this being a strong rating or not necessarily a strong rating as well.
That's correct. Yes. If I go to the course, I think it's the courses one. Obviously, showcasing your own work is really interesting. Yeah, here we go. How are students admitted? And this is where we get the breakdown so this one here, this is clearly 72% ATAR based. Let me see if I can find one that, here we go, Bachelor of Agricultural Studies. Let's see what that says. They're all ATAR based as well. What's interesting with this one though, so the published rank looks like the selection rank is 75, but the actual lowest admitted is 70. So part of those things is trying to surface, I guess, the different signals.
So, to give an example, if a student was choosing University A over here, and they could, go into after ATAR, they could look down to the university, they can dive down into the particular course that they're potentially interested in studying, and then they can compare, what's been advertised and the truth about where students have been admitted in the past, of course. Like, past is no guarantee of future performance.
Correct.
Okay, investment circle. But that just allows you to say, okay, like, I'm working in my HSC, I'm looking for this course that's an 80 or an 80, like, let's say it's an 80. But I can see in the data, in fact, this university has regularly been taking students that get a 72. That doesn't mean that you only need a 72, but maybe that does take a little bit of pressure off you being like, well, actually, I've probably got a better chance than it looks on paper of actually getting to this course, even if I don't necessarily hit 80. So
100%. Yep. That is exactly the question. This is that approach that this is trying to answer. And I've done a very poor guide through, but it's I don't think about how to showcase it yet. But yes, you're completely correct that it's about finding the alternative pathway into a course without that stress. It's essentially, if you're boiling it down to that, and then finding if is it a good fit. Asking, if our way of learning is becoming quite personalized, then our way of assessing what's going to be a good fit for us should also be personalized as well.
Can we maybe just pull one more example?
Yeah.
I'm thinking about that sort of student dropout, right? I think this is really interesting data. So maybe while you're pulling up an example that we can look at of dropping out data. There's lots of reasons why students drop out of university. In fact, we have information that explains why students drop out of university. Of course, there's personal reasons, there's financial pressure, but there's a big element in that which is about expectations not being met. Now, some of that is because, don't mean to pick on parents, but mum and dad have always said I should become a fill in the blank, and I end up in this subject, and this just isn't me. Or literally, you think that you're interested in animal sciences, turns out you're not interested in animal sciences, so you drop out. Okay, always good to change. Don't get me wrong, it's always good to change. But what I think is fascinating around this kind of withdrawal data, the dropout stuff, is that it does show you, like, what percentage of students are getting into this course and being like, whoa, this isn't quite what I expected. So I think it's an interesting one to dig into. So can you talk us through this example that you've pulled up, Jason?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one to configure because dropout, completion, retention, um, they're all sensitive signals around
Okay.
how an institute that the churn, I guess, within an institution. You might have high application rates, you might have high offer rates, but you're churning through, so many students that the institution is thriving or surviving, but it's leaving um, a lot of pain, I guess, behind it. Um,
Nice. So having a look here, what can we see?
well, currently we're looking at University of Sydney.
Yeah,
96% came back for year two, which is really good, and
it's
94
really good.
and they had a pass rate of 94%. So
Mhm.
they do well, generally speaking. The dropout trend has stabilized. Obviously, as we all know, the sector has been recovering, and it's still recovering from COVID.
I
So,
really like those trend lines. That to me is something that people should look at because it tells you broadly how an institution is tracking. So even if one
yes.
year's up, one year's down, if over the last 7 years an institution's been declining in some aspect,
Hmm.
that's a signal for you that you should pay attention. And it's something you should think about. Do you want to go to an institution where things are improving, Oop, or where things are declining? It doesn't mean absolutely yes or absolutely no, but it's great to be aware of. And actually,
Fully
Jason,
agree.
The other thing that you mentioned just before, which I think is fascinating, is the ability to see what percentage of students that apply for a particular course actually get in.
Hmm.
Because a lot of people, we're trying to set our preferences, we're trying to decide, you know, what's our what do you call it, stretch goal. We really want to try and get into this one, you know, and then what are my most realistic options? So how would you do that? How would you start to look at that kind of question?
Yeah, so you can search, you can get into the data via discipline, not field, because field data is the
Yes.
granularity of field is not available in the current
Yeah.
data. I've got to go back to this to the government and say, hey, are you able to provide it at that particular level? But you can go at discipline. Unfortunately, it's the really big disciplines. Medicine will include nursing and midwifery and so forth. You can go in via course name, you can go in via institution, you can go in via state and so forth. And so that'll bring up the courses that you're after. Within the courses, you can look at the breakdown of the pathways. I think that's the most important data around, how do people get into this program?
Yeah.
What's the offer rate? I mean, you might be working really, really hard for an impossible ATAR, and then you look at the institution and you realize, oh, okay, 100% of their applications or their preferences get 100% of offers.
Yeah.
Really important data, really takes away some of the stress if that's the institution you want to go to and that's the program you want to go to. Um, yeah, it's broken down within it. It's also provides those contradictory data points. This is what the institution published versus this is what actually happens.
Yeah.
And then also the comparison within the sector. What is the differences, between an institution that claims, to be this good in a particular area, and yet everyone's going to this particular institution. And there's signals there that need that unpacking, and I'm slowly working through it.
Fantastic thing that you've created with this with After ATAR, an amazing resource for prospective students. Maybe just by way of closing, what advice would you have for 18-year-old Jason if you're going back to give yourself a piece of advice about choosing a university?
That's a tricky one. I
Obviously, use After ATAR to dive into the dive into
Yeah,
the
yeah,
data,
it
but outside of that,
yeah, I so my advice would be, yeah, you have options. Yeah, you're not making the decision that will lock you in. It's not like the degree you're doing or the subject you're doing or the course you're doing, that's it, you're done. If I've learned anything, my career has been and continues to be rather accidental.
mm,
And it's about, applying yourself to different interests and different things. And I would certainly say, I guess to the young me, is that you can change your mind. And that part of this is, like I remember, and like I failed high school. I got, what was it, 60 in history and 49 in English, and it was just a horrible and difficult period, and having to pivot from what I was aiming for and going into something else, and then ended up doing drama and communications and cultural studies. Never regretted it, but that transition from that final year into the first year, it was hard. Being able to think, well, okay, these are the things I'm interested in. Where can I go? Where can I do them? What's required of me in order to be able to do that? And I don't want to go through the experience I went through. The message would
Sorry.
be, you've got choices, you've got options, you've got choices.
My guest in this session has been Jason Ensor, who's the creator of After ATAR. You can find details about After ATAR in the session description down below, and very easily via Google as well. Jason, thanks for joining me at National Virtual Expo.
Thank you very much. Been a pleasure.
Well, I hope you got something out of this session. And if you have any questions at all, you can head to choosingyouruni.com and ask Lumen. Lumen is your AI guide who knows about every university, every pathway, every option that we've talked about throughout this virtual expo. And Lumen is available to talk to you 24/7. So it's ready when you are.